And before we begin, I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is within the Aboriginal territory of the Suquamish, people of clear salt water, the Suquamish. Expert fishers, canoe builders, and basket weavers, the Suquamish live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquamish live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Poet Laureate Treaty of 1855. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. And thank you for coming to this edition of Curated Conversations. We are very honored to have Rena Priest with us, the Washington State's 6th Poet Laureate, and she's going to present Writing as Refuge.
Ait sgwael nas jalacha, lochilakson quanasatla tiakaya, sachweltanat, sanasnat chachlamisan. So happy to be with you all here this evening. Thank you for coming out on a rainy evening and, coming to spend a little time. So I'll just go ahead and jump right in. When I was in graduate school, I took an oral history class, and we were visited by an emergency medical technician. And he shared with us that the first thing that they do is they try to get the person who was in an accident or injured or whatever, who the person they were responding to, they would try to get them talking to tell their story. And this helped for a number of reasons. First of all, it kept them from slipping into shock, but it helped them to process what had happened so that later, they would know, they would be able to integrate that experience better. And so storytelling is powerful in the way that it can be a refuge to understanding ourselves, right? And I believe that storytelling through writing is even more powerful, because if writing is thinking and you can edit what you write, if you can change what you write, then you can change what you think. And so this is really a powerful thing to have in your toolbox, because, if you have thoughts or beliefs or, habits of thinking that are not helpful to you, just like when you're writing and you cross out a line and go, well, that doesn't work. You can cross out that thought pattern and, just kind of have a way to visualize that and, start somewhere new. And so that is one way to use writing as refuge. We can write our way out of negative self-talk, and we can also use writing to clearly visualize the future for ourselves. When I was a job skills instructor, I used to have a series of activities that I took clients through step by step. Many of these involved writing down where we had come from and where we wanted to go. And at the end of the process, many of my clients were able to find fulfilling work. So after helping one client land her dream job, I thought, wow, geez, I should try this. And I took the assessment that I gave to all my clients, and I had this whole spiel. I would tell them that the assessment was linked to a database of more than 50,000 jobs listed with the Department of Labor. And so there was something in there just for them. This is like my little spiel, right? And despite this, I never really felt like there was anything for me as far as work. And I enjoyed my work as a job skills instructor, but it never really felt like my life's work. Then one day I came across a poem by the dervish poet Hafiz. He said, "If your heart cannot find joyful work, the jaws of this world will probably grab hold of your sweet ass." It was oddly threatening, but also reassuring, because it implied that there's such a thing as joyful work. So what could that be? I took the assessment that I gave to clients, and guess what? It said I should be a poet. Yeah, it was crazy. And that was the day that I learned that poet is a real job, because it was listed right there with the Department of Labor. in their database. So, as a child, I told my mom, I'm going to be a poet when I grew up. I'm going to be a poet when I grew up. But I didn't really ever consider that that was like a thing that people did to make money. I had always only used it as a refuge, a place to scurry into and survive, and to maintain a sense of self and sanity in a crazy world. So until then, I had never really given myself permission to just go ahead and give it a go. And then after that, I thought, well, I think I'm going to follow all these steps that I have these folks do when they come and see me. And I did. And within a year of doing the things that I brought people through, I was named Poet Laureate of Washington State. And so maybe my calling actually is to be a job skills instructor. Anyhow, now that I've had the experience of being a professional poet and writing towards commissions for a few years, I realized that in a way it's a much more valuable and sustaining tool it's much more valuable as a creative refuge, poetry, writing. And I'm trying to find my way back to this little sacred sanctuary in my heart, the creative well from which one draws the sweetest, coolest water. I have returned to the poems I love, the ones that made me fall in love with poetry, the ones used as refuge. When as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Next when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. Right? To be able to have that little moment of beauty just by reciting that to yourself and to think about, to see that little movie and that little image and to feel that way that you feel when you see something beautiful and have it put into words and to be able to relate to it is a refuge. And I use it all the time, right? And also similarly, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Sweetest in the gale is heard, and on this, oh, now, see, wow, look, I got nervous. I'm looking at you all, and I can't remember the words. I won't try again, because that's just going to be crazy. But when I'm driving in my car, sometimes, if it feels hopeless, bam, it's right there. It's right there for you, like so many things. I was at a reading a few weeks ago, and two poets had mentioned that they met in a grocery store, and I instantly thought of that poem by Allen Ginsberg, A Supermarket in California, What are you doing, Garcia Lorca, down there by the watermelons? So you have all of these ways to like run off into little snippets of verse and to participate in beauty as a poet or as a writer. So when I became Poet Laureate, I went to my Lhaq'temish teachers to ask for what the word was for poet or poem in our language. And they said, well, it could be tiwich, which is a prayer. It can be stilam, which is a song, or it can be a shwiyam, which is a story. And I really appreciated that because, the way that poetry has served in my life has accessed all three. You turn to it when you need a little story to tell yourself. You turn to it when you have a little song on your heart, and so that was beautiful. Poetry as a vibration that's organized in a special way. It has a cadence like music. Often, my favorite poems do. And I was talking to another author recently, and she was telling me that as long as she's singing, she can't get stuck in negativity or worry. And so she sings all the time. And I really loved that. And it sort of has the same impact on the page. Here's another poem by Robert Herrick. That first poem about Julia's clothes is by Robert Herrick. And this actually, it's debated whether or not this poem contains the first emoticon. There's a little smiley face. There's like a colon and a parentheses at the end of this line. Tumble me down and I will sit upon my ruins, smiling yet. So, and then he ends it with that little emoji, right? So, and it's from 1648. So you make discoveries on the page too. It's not just on the voice, but on the page. And I'll finish that poem. It's called To Fortune by Robert Herrick. Tumble me down and I will sit upon my ruins, smiling yet. Tear me to tatters, yet I'll be patient in my necessity. Laugh at my scraps of clothes and shun me as a feared infection. Yet scarecrow-like, I'll walk as one, neglecting thy derision. So I'm going to share a few poems with you and maybe share a few words about how they gave me sanctuary, each of them. And then I'm going to read an essay and we can open up for a few questions. All right. This poem, Daffodils, is written, it's after Wordsworth, Daffodils. The indigenous poet writes life-affirming poems about daffodils. Her audience says, but you're oppressed. The indigenous poet writes poems of outrage about oppression. Nobody cares. She gets depressed. The indigenous poet gets requests for poems about being indigenous. But all my poems are about being indigenous. The indigenous poet isn't considered an indigenous poet because shouldn't you write about genocide? The indigenous poet tries to write poems about genocide. Her poet spirit dies. Genocide gets the job done. The indigenous poet says "Stangta Tamhuila" and writes about daffodils and the untouchable beauty of living a poet's life. So I don't know if any of you have been to any of my readings or talks before, but I like to point out that, well, I'll share first that "Stangta Tamhuila" means what the hail, like hail that comes down from the sky. We didn't have swear words in the language, and we didn't have any concept of hell. So amazing, right? 200 years ago, nobody here burned eternally. And it's just beautiful. But so I almost said "Stengta Spachwang," which would have been with the fog, but I thought, no, that's too spicy. So I wrote that poem after after Wordsworth, because I was thinking about Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and he talks about being depressed, and he comes up over this hillside, and he sees the daffodils swaying in the breeze, and then he feels uplifted and connected and at one with everything, and he's no longer depressed, he's happy, and he just feels great. And I thought that's a beautiful universal experience that everybody can appreciate, because, part of being a human being is that when we are in nature and we see something beautiful, how can we possibly be sad, right? You can feel connected to it. And I love it that he wrote that poem and felt at liberty to write that poem. And probably nobody said to him, hey, Willie, why don't you write those poems about being an old white guy? Like, probably nobody ever said that to him, but every time I would read a poem at like an open mic or whatever, when I was first getting going, that was always the question. I would do my whole set, I'd give it my all, read these poems about like appreciating beauty and everything. And then there would always be people that would come up and be like, why don't you write about being an Indian? I'd be like, oh, okay. So I thought, well, I'll write this poem and that'll be my answer. And then nobody will ever ask me that after the show ever again. I can just write about all the beauty that I want, and that'll be that, right? So, so now I lead with that. Okay. Anyhow, this one is. This one, it was a little bit harder for me to write, actually much, much harder. It's autobiographical, which I don't write very often. And when I was Poet Laureate, the Museum of Northwest Art hosted an exhibit on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that's a hard topic, and it hits home for me in particular because I was raised in a household where my stepsister's mother had been murdered and had been missing before they discovered what had happened. And so the person who was coordinating that exhibit knows me personally, and she reached out and said, "Will you write this poem?" And I said, "Oh my God." I've been trying to avoid writing this poem for, my whole life probably. But in writing it, I feel like it was, in a way, it is a refuge to face something. And so this is the poem. It's called Nation Made of Homes, with an epigraph. It's a Cheyenne proverb that says, "A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground." 40 years ago, my stepsister's mother went missing, was murdered, her body found in a riverbed. The house I grew up in was filled with her absence. My mother tried to make that home happy and bright, to restore its grand and beautiful life. But the walls were covered with grief, like flaking grim lead paint. Grief poured from the taps like mercury. Grief hung heavy in our chests like black mold spores. At first, I was too young to know what all that grieving was for, but I felt it. My stepsister cried in the dark of our shared room. My stepfather was restless and glum. My mother wept and moaned that she lived in the shade of a ghost. It went on this way for almost a decade until I grew up and moved away, out into the fresh air and sunshine. But that feeling clung to me, the sense that something was missing, had been taken away, that at any moment the world would be torn and never mend. My mother eventually abandoned hope of ever making that house a home. Now she lives alone, complains of ghosts. My stepsister finally laid down in the river of her grief, went to the other side to find her mother. And that house, that once grand and beautiful home, is boarded up on all sides, the windows, closed eyes of the conquered. We must not let it be so. Those eyes are closed, not in defeat, but healing rest, waiting for us women to lift our hearts from the ground and dance the light back in. So, in a way, it's healing to tell the hard stories. It's sanctuary to just tell the hard stories. What is it they say? There's no way out but through. So this way that poetry offers refuge is a way through as well. And it's still hard. That story is still hard. It will always be hard. But to have faced it now, it means I don't have to do that again. I know what it looks like. I've been through that poem earnestly and with courage. So this is also a way that poetry is refuge. And here's a poem that actually has a beautiful story with it. It was written to accompany a song. The next poem was written to accompany a song by my friend Delbert Anderson. And he's a renowned trumpet player. And the song that he wrote was inspired by a landscape located in Aztec, New Mexico, where there's a national monument called the Ark. And underneath the Ark, there's a little dried up wash, and it probably only goes about 30 or 40 feet, but it's perfect and untouched. And there are no footprints, no bushes or leaves on it. It's just a flat surface, and it's perfectly straight. So Delbert, as I mentioned, he's a renowned trumpet player from Shiprock, New Mexico. He's Dene, and I've toured with him over the past 3 years, and we've played shows all over the country. And he told me the story of how he showed a picture of the Ark to his elders, and they told him that this old wash in the desert is called the Heart Passage. And how that name, it goes back to how when the human is born, we're perfect. Everyone is perfect at the very beginning, but when the world gets a hold of us, that's when we start to develop different characters and stresses and all these different things. But the heart passage is something that people need to get back to when things get too difficult and crazy. And the elders told Delbert, always remember you're a perfect human being inside. And so he wrote a beautiful song to symbolize the heart passage. And this poem is inspired by that song. And it's normally set to his music, but I thought it might be nice to share it with you today since we're talking about poetry as refuge. On the path we walk towards purpose, if we feel we've lost our way, if our confidence deserts us and we fear we've gone astray, when the road stretched out before us is a challenging terrain, this is when we search our heart for a passage back to grace. Our heart has wisdom to impart if we are true and brave, and though the night is dark, there is always a new day. When every door we try is locked and the view out every window is of that lonely road we walked, full of worry, want, and woe. When the stream of life within is blocked by living in our sorrow, this is when we search our heart for a passage to tomorrow. Our heart has wisdom to impart if we are true to what we feel. Yes, indeed the night is dark, but our heart has answers to reveal. It says living is a simple art when we follow our true, perfect being, and will not stumble in the dark when we let our heart do all the seeing. So it's a little more sing-songy than I normally will write, but it goes with that beautiful trumpet, and I thought, what the heck, why not? Maybe one more poem, and then I'll get into this essay. Let's see here. Sorry, it's hot under the lights. All right, this poem is called A Poem is a Naming Ceremony. What has grown out of what has gone away? The clear-cut patch has grown larger on the mountain. The rivers have grown murky with timber trash, and there's enough runoff cow manure to grow corn out there on the tide flats. I don't want to think about what has gone away. I want to meander and play and forget myself until I can grow a new me in place of all this grief. Learn the language to see the cottonwood as Quayalich each, the dancing tree, the killer whales as Quilhamachin, our relatives under the sea, the whole glorious landscape filled with meaning to end my grieving. When I was young, I was invited to learn Qilnuchkin, the people's language. But I said no, I didn't understand. I thought I wanted to learn how to be rich. I didn't know that the only way to possess all the wealth of the world is by naming it. Here is bird song, here is the kiss of a lover, here is the feel of cold water at the peak of summer. I have spent my life with words trying to name a hint of what I lost by not learning my language. Estitemsin, tutatistsin, estitemsin. So those last three words are, I'm doing my best, I'm still learning, I'm doing my best. And we teach, that's the first thing that they teach you when you start learning the Lhaq'temish, so that you can keep going, because it's hard to learn. I've been trying for several years now, and I'm just so at it. But okay, let's see, what time is it? 7:30. A couple more minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. So the word essay comes from, it means to weigh, literally. So when you're writing an essay, you're weighing it. And I have found that in this weighing, something heavy on my heart through the process of weighing, of writing an essay, becomes lighter. I can figure some things out. And this essay is not an exception to the rule. It is maybe an example of it. So I'll go ahead and share this essay. It's fairly recent. It's kind of new. It's called Defenses of Peace in the Biosphere Reserve. I arrive at the Cascade Head Biosphere Reserve and Experimental Forest on March 1st, 2024. Cascade Head is one of 28 UNESCO biosphere reserves in the United States. Excuse me one second. Thank you so much. I don't know why, but when I'm under lights, sometimes I feel like I'm going to sneeze. All right, so let me start over. I arrive in the Cascade Head Biosphere Reserve and Experimental Forest on March 1st, 2024. Cascade Head is one of 28 UNESCO biosphere reserves in the United States. There are 309 such reserves in 41 countries worldwide. This place is special not only for its beauty, but also for its distinction as the first scenic research area in the United States. It was made such by Congress in 1974 to protect and restore the region's ecological integrity. I am here as the inaugural fellow of a literary residency for Indigenous writers. To better understand UNESCO's role in the Biosphere Reserve, I turn to their website. I find a quote from their constitution. Since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So that settles it. I am here to construct defenses of peace. A peaceful mind responding constructively to ecological violence and the spiritual disturbances that result. My first morning in the reserve, I wake to snow, make coffee, build a fire, and let the peaceful beauty of the place settle on me like snow soundlessly falling into the valley below. The cabin has wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling windows and is perched on a hillside with a peekaboo view of the Salmon River, which meanders to the grand drama of the Pacific Ocean, crashing ashore less than a mile away. The days pass, and of course I am happy and grateful to be here. But it is an uneasy happiness, a gratitude existing on the same coin as grief. As an Indigenous person, to be in a beautiful home, in a beautiful place, is never a simple enjoyment. In such a house, built on the homelands of displaced peoples, colonizer violence is always standing in the corner, trying not to be noticed. Amid the charming architecture skillfully aimed at highlighting the landscape to make one feel as though they are a participant in nature rather than a spectator, occasionally cheering from the luxury box. In the most beautiful places, it is difficult to be at peace fully, because I am always aware that the people who belonged to the place, who lived here because of its beauty, cared for the place for thousands of years because of its beauty, had spiritual beliefs and practices that were fused with the well-being of this place because of its innate beauty and function. I am always aware that those original people didn't simply leave because new people arrived on their shores. These places, all up and down the coast, every watershed, every nook and cranny of hospitable, desirable land, through violence or threat of violence, were taken. And once taken, the violence was turned from the original inhabitants to the landscape itself. Ancient forests felled, salmon rivers dammed and dammed, buffalo herds systematically exterminated to break down indigenous resistance by destroying food sovereignty to make way for privately held domesticated livestock. The introduction of livestock, agriculture, clear cuts, mines, and factories destroyed native flora and deprived species that relied on those wild harvests so integral to survival. Each of these beings, like the original people, contributed to the balance of their homelands. There is an assumed cultural supremacy about colonizer science that discounts knowledge rooted deep in a relationship to place. This type of science often serves the interests of extraction rather than integration. Rich men who pay for studies will never set foot in a place, yet say with confidence that we primitive savages lived here in ignorance of how to cultivate our land and therefore have no right to it or the wealth it contains. For centuries now, they've been handing us pickaxes and plows, backhoes and hydroelectric dams, the tools of our collective destruction, and telling us to get to work becoming civilized. At the same time, they line their pockets with the spoils of our sacred homelands and the fruits of our labor. Am I angry? I am cultivating my mind in defense of peace. The word integrity comes from the Latin root integer, meaning intact. In this biosphere reserve, where I am trying to make my mind a vehicle for peace, I must wrestle with the fact that the Western Hemisphere, and indeed the world, is not intact. We live in a society built on the destruction of integrity. With this knowledge, I don't know where in my mind to construct a sanctuary, where a peaceful thought might live. So I read. I search for understanding, something to say. I read books on how to write, books on history, books on art. I read Caste by Isabella Wilkerson, learn all the gruesome details of the American caste system. I read Cosmic Scholar, about an anthologist who recorded indigenous spiritual songs to save them from oblivion. I read Shapes of Native Nonfiction and encounter so much alchemy, courageous voices transforming the shadows of genocide into strength and places where light can once again shine. It is hopeful but difficult. I grow sad. I call my cousin and we chat about it. She tells me she's upset about Gaza. Seeing Palestinians subjected to violence, starvation, and isolation strategies that were endured by indigenous communities not so very long ago is triggering for her. There's no help for them, she says. Just like there was no help for our ancestors and nobody will tell their stories the way they should be told. I think about how the genocide in Gaza began with the burning of ancient olive groves. We end our phone call trying to encourage each other, but I am still sad. My cousin's talk of Gaza makes me recall a recent breakfast with my dad and his girlfriend, a rich white woman from California. The crisis in Palestine came up in our conversation and she said, "It's just terrible. They should be allowed to have a reservation too. Everyone deserves somewhere to live." Then she changed the subject to conversation better paired with her Bloody Mary. My husband watched to see if I would keep the peace. Of course I would keep the peace. What could be gained by shit-stirring with Gloria? Now her words come back to me. Everyone deserves somewhere to live. About that, she is correct. There is no need for a whole genocide right now. There was no need for one beginning in 1492 and continuing on for hundreds of years. There is no need for the burning of olive groves, the extermination of buffalo, the eradication of biodiversity in favor of domesticated, monetizable monoculture. There never has been a need for it. Since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Everyone deserves somewhere to live. Fish, birds, wildflowers, trees, and bugs, spaces for holistic habitation should be preserved and protected, and this effort by UNESCO is beautiful. Still, it would be better if we as a species didn't condemn healthy ecology to such oppressively small quarters. It would be better if the Biosphere Reserve were the big one, the original homelands, the whole planet. To draw a little boundary around a space and declare it nature, preserved, is like the legendary king trying to carpet his kingdom to protect his delicate feet rather than wear shoes. It's good to make the initial step toward protecting something, but as my mind strives toward peace, it keeps returning to an obvious conclusion. We must try to find a way back to integration, a way of being intact. How? I think it begins with belief. I remember hearing my friend tell a story of when he was a little boy at the beach with his grandmother. He was smashing rocks against each other, and his grandmother said, "Leave the rocks alone." She told him there were beings who lived in the rocks who shouldn't be bothered. He believed her, so he left the rocks alone, understanding that the earth has rights. I believe there are answers in ancestral knowledge. I'm not talking about this in some kind of a woo-woo way. I'm talking about it from a standpoint of Indigenous knowing. I was listening to a neuroscientist talk about gut reactions. She explained how our gut is connected to the nervous system and responds when we know something intuitively. The interviewer asked her, "What is intuition?" She said that we have a limited amount of access to memory, but everything we've ever encountered is stored somewhere in our brains, even if we can't easily retrieve it. All our accumulated knowledge and experience is still there, and when we have to make a decision with limited information, our intuition kicks in. We have a feeling, a physical feeling about what needs to be done. She said that this accumulation of information and awareness of the world gained through experience is the reason older people have a stronger sense of intuition. In my tribal community, elders are revered for this reason. What if honing intuition through accumulating knowledge and experience works the same way over generations? Imagine living in a place for your whole life. You would learn its patterns, what grew where, when the tide turned, what drew the fish and game, and how to harvest so that more would return next time. You would feel safe and connected to your surroundings. Now imagine your DNA thriving in those landscapes and waterways, forming symbiotic spiritual and physical relationships there for 10, 15, 20,000 years. You would have connections to that place that newcomers couldn't replicate. The food there would be tied to your gut flora, and those special brain-body pathways for instinct and intuition would be supported by the food you ate, the water you drank. In search of the science of integration, I turn to the oral histories of my ancestors. Their brilliant, integrated worldview is soothing in the perfect sense it makes. For example, in Lummi lore, it is said that if we treat the salmon with respect, they will travel from their longhouse, the smoke of which is like a rainbow, and journey to the fishing sites to be food for the people. I wonder what kind of fire makes smoke like a rainbow. How does the fire of the salmon people burn? I don't know, but its power is restorative. In old Lummi culture, there is a belief in a world under the water that mirrors our own. It is upside down. Tiny things are big and big things are tiny. Smoke is made of rainbows. Here in our world, rainbows come when the sun shines after the life-giving rains. A rainbow is a symbol of renewal, so smoke made of rainbows is a symbol of new life, and the fire of the salmon people is not destructive, but creative. When the salmon return, they are the spark of life that will carry us into a new season, a spark that finds fuel is the beginning of fire. An electrician once told me that a high-voltage electrical arc can be as hot as the surface of the sun. The sun, of course, is a star. A star, of course, is a fire. Are we not made of the stars? Are we not also fire? Yes, we are. Fire consumes. Fire destroys. People consume. People destroy. But fire also purifies and makes space for new life, so it is both destructive and creative. We have our place here, just as the salmon people have their smoke rainbows in the sea. Did you hear about the rainbow who got in trouble? It had to go to prison. It was a light sentence. If you use sound waves to burst a bubble underwater, it will expire in a flash of light. Light, which by its nature is a rainbow. The phenomenon is called sonoluminescence. Science can't fully explain it. Another phenomenon that science can't fully explain is called wave-particle duality. It is studied via what is known as the double-slit experiment. In the experiment, light behaves as discrete particles unless observed, in which case it acts as a wave. Is it childlike to try to understand this inexplicable fact by saying that the universe at the level of particles is conscious? In my culture, it is not unusual to go and express gratitude and prayer to the water. The water is conscious. Like light, it behaves as both particles and waves. Why would light not be the same? It is the same. In my ancestral language, the word for river is also the word for Milky Way. A river of light in the sky, a river of billions of burning suns. It continues the idea of the mirror world under the waves, the multi-layered nature of existence. Everything is connected. The ancestors understood this deeply. A friend of mine shared a story about his visit to a national forest in Oregon. The tour host was a geologist who gave a presentation on what he calls the mythic dimensions of his research, which otherwise is rooted in what he calls hard-ass science of geophonics, biophonics, and anthropophonics, sounds made by different components of the world. The talk overviewed ecological interconnections through sound and how a fish in need of a home can send out a signal which is received by the forest and the roots of trees, which may respond by felling a tree over the stream in exactly the right place to slow the current and make the stream habitable for fish. Spawning salmon bring nutrients from the ocean into the forest, so salmon have symbiotic relationships with the trees and the underground fungal networks that connect them. I don't know if this is why the tree would respond the way it did, but what this story seems to want to teach is a fundamental understanding of one of my favorite features of reality, that the right combination of wishing, need, and expression can find an audience with a conscious and benevolent universe. That the universe in its infinite intelligence, with the infinite connections between the fires that shine above and those that glimmer below, will seek balance, will hear a request and find a way to make it so. And remembering this good teaching about having faith in the benevolence and wisdom of nature, I have finally constructed a defense of peace in my mind. So that, I think, is what I will share for reading. And if there are questions, I think now's the time.
And I can pass the mic to whoever has any questions.
Thank you so much for this tonight. It's very moving. I would love to hear you talk about what the role is of the writer in this day and age. Obviously, as an indigenous writer, that might be very different than, another writer from another culture. So I think this conversation is always very lively and very rich, and everybody's trying to figure it out. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that the role of the writer still is to be a truth teller. I think that it's harder in. I was listening to a podcast talking about cancel culture. And the way everybody, I think the title of the podcast, or maybe the woman whose book, who was featured on the podcast, was "Let's Cancel Everybody." And it kind of feels that way sometimes. And I think that really the role of the writer is going to be less involved in participating in capitalism than just telling the truth, really, telling their truth, even if it's not just, connected to some big movement of any kind, but to just say what they need to say. And I feel that because during my time as Poet Laureate, I said a lot of what I thought people wanted to hear, and also specifically what they asked me for, right? I responded to a lot of commissions as Poet Laureate, and a lot of it, of course, was reflecting my beliefs, but it wasn't something that came out of that creative well that I mentioned that is so sustaining for me as a creative person. It came out of like some other intellectual place of puzzling, and I put my emotion with it and put it out into the world. But I feel like when something needs to be said by the creator, it is always hundreds of times more potent and powerful and beautiful. And so I think that the role of the writer is really going to be complicated by algorithms and marketing and someone sent me a thing on how to write a pitch too. This is kind of funny. And it's like, traditional pitches, you got to make a sizzle reel. You got to make a 2-minute sizzle reel and really get them reel them into your personality. And I'm like, oh my God, I became a writer so I wouldn't have to reel anybody into my tragic personality. But, that's kind of more of like the business of writing, right? And I think that more and more the demand is that you participate in that. And the justification was from this agent was like, well, publishing houses don't really have PR and marketing people to just kind of look after everybody anymore. So you kind of have to do it yourself now as a writer. And I was like, ew, I guess I'm going to get out of this thing as a business then, because I don't want to think of myself as a PR person, right? I want to continue to think of myself as a writer. And so I think to do that, I'm going to have to just accept that there's maybe fewer pathways to publishing for me, and that's okay. Yeah. Great question. Thank you.
Rena, the salmon anthology that you put together is so beautiful.
Thank you.
It is such a great project. What a beautiful gift you gave the whole Pacific Northwest with that. So could you talk a little bit about that? And I think it just needs to be applauded. It's such a beautiful book. And I'm kind of curious of what surprised you about the process?
Okay.
And you brought together so many different voices, and I'd just love to hear kind of more about what that was like for you personally, and and more.
Definitely. So that was a project that I was really passionate about. That's one of the fortunate places where my passion aligned with what other people wanted from me. So that was fortunate. A few years ago, before the pandemic and everything, I was invited by a friend to be a guest editor, or another editor on a project called For Love of Orcas. And I really, really wanted to do it, but my daughter was kind of trying to learn how to drive and head off into towards graduation and all of this other stuff. And I had other projects going and I couldn't do it. I couldn't take it on just then. And he said, well, what would be your ideal project? And I said, I would really love to work on a salmon anthology because, while I love orcas, the reason they're endangered is because salmon are endangered. They're an indicator species, right? Orcas are an indicator species, and salmon are a keystone species. Everybody relies on them. And of course, to my people, salmon are sacred. And so I said, I would really love to collect a salmon anthology. And so I feel like when you put that out into the universe, like a wish like that, some way or another, it's going to come to be. And when I got to the platform of Poet Laureate, and then when I got the funding from Academy of American Poets, when I had the opportunity to apply for that funding, I said, this is it. This is the salmon anthology. So I proposed that, and the funding came through, and they said, okay, but you can't tell anyone that you're getting this grant until, we announce it officially, which meant that I couldn't solicit submissions or anything until they announced it. And they were supposed to announce in June. And then they said, well, I think we're going to wait and we're going to announce in August. And so I was like, oh no, how am I going to get everybody to send poems, right? And but I waited, and August 1st came and they made the announcement, and I had the launch all ready to go for the call for submissions and stuff. And so I put that out, and I started just putting it everywhere that I could think of. And I thought maybe I'll get 100 poems, because I had from August 1st to October 1st to have the call for submissions open. And, I'm thinking, how many people are out there writing about salmon in Washington? And, 2 months is not very long. So I was also calling friends, and I had a friend who asked me if I'd blurb his book. I was like, I'll do it, but you have to write a poem about salmon and give it to me. And it was kind of outside of his wheelhouse, but it ended up being such a perfect salmon poem in his voice and reflective of his personality. But I was like reaching out to people, being like, do you have salmon poems? I was kind of frantically looking for under every rock. But turns out I did not need to do that, because in the 2 months the call for submissions was open, over 300 poets responded with more than 700 poems. And it was kind of overwhelming. It just kind of blew my mind a little bit. And I was like, oh my God, I got to read all these now, And but that was the fun part, to see like how much love people have for our sacred salmon. It's just really beautiful to be able to read all those poems and then to kind of visualize an order for them. And as I was kind of reading them and selecting, after I'd made the selection of what I wanted to include, I thought, how do I? And that was really hard, actually, because there were a lot that I wish I would have been able to put in, but they gave me kind of like a rough page number, and I was always at the upper end of that. And then they're like, you're gonna have to thin it out just to stay on budget. But so got it to where I kind of knew what I wanted to include, and then I saw that there were these themes that kind of kept emerging, and so like I thought maybe I'll put them into categories, and it was a really fun project to work on, and I was so happy with how it turned out, and just beyond grateful for all of the support from everybody for that project. It was really cool. Yeah, and I got to travel around to different communities. I tried to go to like, every region in the state and host a reading. I missed Central Washington, but they have just a really exceptional poetry community there in Ellensburg, and they put one together, and they did a reading last month to launch it and celebrate it. So that was cool. I didn't get to go. I was in Alaska, but but I got to see the pictures, so it was fun. Yeah. I think, any other questions? I think that actually brings us almost to the end. Maybe one more? Yeah. Yeah.
I just wondered, I think there's something so magic about getting a different worldview into people's heads, and I'm always trying to write my way into other worldviews. And I just wondered if you would like to talk any more about that. I just think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, I think it's important to read a lot of work by people whose worldview you want to kind of understand. And I mean, like it's there's this phenomenon of like pan-Indian, right? Which kind of came about from the Relocation Act, where the government was trying to move natives into cities and like, train us into trades and stuff and get us off the reservation. That was like their response to like economic distress, was to get us off the res. But so that created pan-Indianism, which is like this nationwide identity, almost kind of like urban Indian. And then otherwise, there are more than 500 individual tribes nationwide. I think it's like 562 or something like that. All very unique and individual. Even at Lummi, from family to family, customs are a little bit different. But as soon as you like go to a neighboring tribe, and we've experienced this through the intertribal canoe journeys, it's totally different customs just 20 miles down the road or whatever. Even like a different language group or dialect. So it's kind of because we're taught that's not our way. Like, I would never, like, there's a lot of respect around, like, if we learn a song, we have to know whose family, like, where it comes from, and share that. And just, there's just a lot of respect and protocol around if we want to share something from a different community. We have to say, oh, this comes from Stillaguamish, and it was taught to me by so-and-so, and it was taught to them by so-and-so. So we were given that lineage. And so I don't really, I mean, like, I know I wrote the poem after Wordsworth, so I'm like kind of culturally appropriating you all, but but I don't think I could ever do that to like another community, just like, and that's hard because, there are stories there that need telling too, but I might do it in a way that said, okay, this comes from a person's story at whatever the community, and share it that way. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Rena. Everyone, in partnership with Eagle Harbor Books, we're selling some of Rena's books tonight, and she'll stay after to sign